In 1954, President Eisenhower vanished for an entire night. Officially, it was a dental emergency. Unofficially, some believe it was a secret meeting with non-human beings, hidden inside a military base in the desert, and a treaty that may have changed the future of humanity forever. Since then, other cases have surfaced that are impossible to ignore. Strange abductions, hybridization programs, ancient structures that seem to defy modern explanation, and theories claiming these entities are not coming from outer space at all, but from another reality. In this video, we will explore 8 of the darkest and most disturbing alien conspiracies ever documented. You think this is a game. They are watching us right now, and nobody is safe until the truth is exposed. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, don't forget to subscribe.
In February 1954, something strange is said to have happened in the United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the most protected and closely monitored men in the world, allegedly disappeared for several hours in a way that would later fuel decades of suspicion and speculation. The official explanation was simple. The public was told that the president had suffered a dental emergency while vacationing in Palm Springs, California. The press received the story, the incident was quickly smoothed over, and political life moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. But for many UFO researchers and conspiracy investigators, that ordinary explanation was exactly what made the story so suspicious. Why would the President of the United States vanish so quietly over what sounded like a routine medical issue? Why were there lingering inconsistencies surrounding his schedule that night? And more importantly, why did this brief disappearance become the foundation of one of the darkest theories in modern alien lore? The idea that the American government made direct contact with non-human beings and reached a secret agreement behind closed doors. According to the story that has circulated for decades in UFO and conspiracy circles, Eisenhower was not taken to a dentist at all. Instead, he was allegedly transported in secret to Edwards Air Force Base, an isolated military installation in the California desert, where a face-to-face meeting with extraterrestrial beings supposedly took place. Some versions of the theory claim the meeting had been arranged months in advance. Others suggest that the US military had already been in contact with these entities for some time, and that this was simply the moment when the matter reached the highest level possible, the president himself. What makes this theory so powerful is not just the idea of a secret meeting, but the detail that appears in almost every version of the story, the treaty. According to the legend, a hidden agreement was made between the US government and a race of beings commonly described as the Greys. The terms of this alleged deal are what make the theory so disturbing. In exchange for advanced technology, knowledge of propulsion, energy systems, and perhaps even weaponry, these beings were supposedly granted permission to operate on Earth under strict secrecy. In some versions, that permission even included the right to conduct limited experiments on human beings, as long as everything remained hidden from the public. This is where the theory becomes truly dark. Because at that point, it is no longer just about a mysterious meeting in a desert military base. It becomes a story about power, secrecy, and the terrifying possibility that world leaders may have agreed to sacrifice ordinary people in exchange for technological superiority. In other words, the conspiracy is not simply that the government covered up the existence of extraterrestrials. It is that it may have entered into a cold and calculated partnership with them. And if that were true, then humanity was never being protected. It was being negotiated away behind closed doors. Over the years, several authors and researchers within ufology have claimed that such a meeting really did happen. Some versions of the story describe not one but 2 different groups of extraterrestrial beings. One group is often portrayed as more peaceful, warning humanity about nuclear weapons and the dangerous direction of modern civilization. The other group, usually identified as the Greys, is described as colder, more clinical, and deeply interested in genetic experimentation. In some tellings, Eisenhower is said to have rejected the first group and instead chosen to deal with the one offering immediate technological benefits. Whether true or not, the symbolism of that choice is hard to ignore. It paints a picture of humanity choosing power over wisdom, control over truth, and short-term advantage over long-term consequences. That is one reason this theory has remained so compelling for so long. It is not really just a story about aliens. It is a story about how power behaves, how far a government, military, or hidden elite might be willing to go if offered an advantage too great to refuse. If a superpower were promised access to impossible technology, how tempting would it be to accept, even if the moral cost was beyond comprehension? Supporters of the theory often connect this alleged treaty to the technological explosion that followed in the second half of the 20th century. Microchips, fiber optics, advanced aerospace engineering, stealth systems, surveillance technologies, and experimental aircraft are sometimes pointed to as possible signs of knowledge that did not originate entirely from human hands. Of course, there is no official evidence proving any of that. But within the logic of the conspiracy, the rapid pace of technological advancement is not seen as coincidence. It is seen as a trail, a visible consequence of a hidden bargain. Another reason the story has endured is because of silence. The lack of any final, definitive explanation that fully closes the door on speculation has allowed the legend to keep growing. Like many major conspiracy theories, it thrives not only because an alternative narrative exists, but because the official one feels too neat, too clean, too convenient. A dental emergency may sound plausible on paper, but for those who believe something else happened, it has always sounded like the perfect cover story. Simple enough to satisfy the public, ordinary enough to discourage deeper questions. As the years passed, the Eisenhower story became linked to a much larger mythology. Dulce Base, Majestic 12, Area 51, reverse engineering programs, underground facilities, government-monitored abductions, secret cooperation between military intelligence and non-human entities. In that wider narrative, Eisenhower's disappearance is not treated as an isolated rumor. It is seen as the beginning, the night when contact was not only acknowledged behind closed doors, but formalized. And that is what makes this theory so fascinating. Not the fact that it is easy to prove, because it is not, but the fact that it touches one of humanity's deepest fears. Not simply that we are not alone in the universe, but that those in power may already know that. And even worse, that decisions may have been made on behalf of the entire human race without consent, without transparency, and without any intention of ever revealing the truth. Because if even part of this theory were true, then the real question is not whether President Eisenhower disappeared for one night in 1954. The real question is what was promised during those missing hours. What was offered? What was allowed? And whether that alleged treaty, hidden from the public for generations, could explain why so many later stories of abductions, experiments, and unexplained encounters seem to echo the same terrifying pattern. At that point, the story stops being about one missing night. It becomes something much bigger. A story about a decision made in secret, above the heads of ordinary people, one that may have shaped the modern world in ways we still do not understand. And if such a treaty ever existed, then it may be one of the most important and most terrifying hidden agreements in modern history.
But the story doesn't end there.
In August 1976, 4 young men went on a camping trip into the wilderness of Maine, in a remote area known as the Allagash Waterway. It was the kind of place where, after dark, nothing seems to exist except water, forest, and silence. Jack and Jim Weiner, along with their friends Charlie Faltz and Chuck Rack, had no idea that this trip would later become one of the most famous and disturbing alleged alien abduction cases in American history. It all began on a night that seemed completely normal. The 4 men were out on the lake far from camp, when they noticed a strange light in the sky. At first, it may have looked like something distant, maybe a bright star or an aircraft seen from an unusual angle. But the light did not stay still. It did not behave like anything ordinary. It seemed to move with purpose, as if it knew exactly where they were. And according to their account, instead of disappearing, it started coming closer. That moment is what makes the entire story so unsettling. Because this was no longer just four men looking up at something strange in the sky. It was the feeling that whatever was up there was looking back at them. That it was not some distant phenomenon, but a presence descending into their space, focusing on them, locking onto them. In many versions of the case, they say they tried to signal toward it with a flashlight or fire, and the object appeared to respond by moving even closer. If that really happened, then that night was not just a sighting. It was first contact. After that, things become unclear. And that is exactly what makes the case so disturbing. One of the most common elements in alleged alien abduction stories is the idea of missing time. A section of the night that simply does not fit together. Minutes or hours that vanish without explanation. In the Allagash case, that is exactly what seems to have happened. The men remembered the light, the fear, and the object approaching. But between that moment and their return to normal, there was a gap. Something seemed to be erased. As if reality had stopped for a short time and then resumed, but with a break their minds could not fill. Years later, the case truly came to the surface and became famous because the story did not end with a strange light in the sky. Through hypnotic regression, the men began describing what they believed had happened during that missing time. And what emerged was far darker than a simple encounter with an unidentified object. According to those accounts, they were not just witnesses to something strange. They had been taken aboard an unknown craft, separated from one another, and subjected to cold, precise examinations completely stripped of emotion. Their descriptions spoke of beings with large heads, unusually large black eyes, and an almost mechanical presence. There is no warmth in this story. No real communication. No attempt to calm them, explain anything, or show any kind of compassion. It feels more like an experiment. As if those beings did not see them as human at all, but as biological subjects to be studied. This is where the Allagash case becomes truly unforgettable. Not because it speaks about aliens in the dramatic Hollywood sense of the word, but because it is about complete helplessness. About the feeling that you can be chosen, taken, and examined against your will, then returned with a fractured mind and incomplete memories. That fear runs deeper than the simple idea of extraterrestrial life. It is the fear of becoming powerless in front of an intelligence that owes you no explanation. Another reason this case became so well known is that it did not involve just one person. It was not a single isolated witness telling an impossible story. It was four men who claimed they had lived through the same basic experience. That gave the story a different kind of weight. For many people, the fact that multiple individuals described the same night as something deeply abnormal made the case even more disturbing. And yet this is also where the story remained trapped in a gray area for decades. Because it did not stay untouched. Over time, doubts appeared, contradictions surfaced, and different versions began to emerge. One of the four later questioned the abduction story and suggested that events had not happened the way they were presented to the public. But that did not close the case. If anything, it made it even more unsettling. Because then the question was no longer only whether they had been abducted or not. It also became a question of how far the human mind can go when trying to make sense of a night it cannot fully explain. And maybe that is where the true power of the Allagash case lies. In the fact that it offers no comfort no matter how you look at it. If you choose to believe the classic account, then you are left with one of the most chilling alleged group abduction cases ever told, in which four men were taken from an isolated place and treated like laboratory specimens. If you choose to look at it skeptically, you are still left with something deeply unsettling, the idea that a strange experience in such a remote place was powerful enough to haunt the people involved and leave behind a story that refused to disappear. And maybe that is exactly what makes Allagash so different from other cases. It is not just a story about a light in the sky. It is the story of one night when four men went out onto the water in a quiet landscape and came back with the feeling that something had been broken forever. That for a few moments, the distance between them and whatever was above them became so small that it could no longer be explained by anything ordinary. And if the darkest part of this story is true, then the Allagash case was not just an encounter. It was a collection. A silent, cold, calculated intervention in which 4 men were not seen as human beings, but as biological material. And maybe the most disturbing part of all is that when it was over, they were left with no clear proof in their hands. Only fear, the gap in their memory, and the conviction that something took them that night. Of all the stories connected to extraterrestrials, few are more disturbing than the idea that human beings were not just observed but used. Not just studied but altered. Because the moment you enter the world of hybridization, everything becomes far more personal and far more unsettling. This is no longer just about lights in the sky or mysterious craft seen from a distance. It is about the human body, reproduction, and the possibility that behind decades of strange encounters, there has been a cold and calculated biological purpose hiding in the dark. In many of the most well-known alien abduction accounts, the same pattern keeps appearing. People say they were taken during the night, paralyzed, brought into an unknown place, and subjected to medical procedures they did not understand. And among all the details that repeat in these stories, one returns again and again in a way that is hard to ignore. The collection of genetic material. As if out of everything humanity could offer, our biology was the one thing they wanted most. Some men claimed they were forced through invasive procedures involving sperm extraction. Some women described gynecological examinations, the feeling that something had been implanted inside them, or even experiences where they believed they had become pregnant, only for that pregnancy to later disappear without any clear explanation. It is exactly these kinds of accounts that made the idea of hybridization so difficult to ignore within alien mythology. Because at this point, nothing about the story feels adventurous or spectacular. Everything becomes cold, clinical, and deeply intimate. It is terrifying not because it feels grand, but because it invades one of the most vulnerable parts of human existence. But the darkest part does not end there. In many of these accounts, people do not only claim that something was taken from them, they also say they were later shown what had been created from it. Strange children. Beings that looked almost human but not entirely. Faces too smooth, skin too pale, eyes too large, movements too stiff. Expressions that seemed to imitate human emotion without fully understanding it. In some cases, the people involved said they were made to understand that these beings were theirs. That they carried their genetic material. That they were, in some deeply disturbing way, a combination of human and something else. At that point, the story stops being just another theory about alien contact. It becomes something much more unsettling. It becomes the idea that human beings may have been used as raw material in an ongoing biological process. Not as partners in communication. Not as a species being studied out of curiosity. But as genetic resources in a program designed to create a new form of life. An intermediate being. Something close enough to us to appear human, but different enough to serve a purpose that does not belong to us. And maybe that is the part that unsettles people the most. Because if even a fraction of these accounts were true, then this would not be about visitors from another world simply watching us. It would be about a presence interfering directly with the future of the human species itself. With reproduction. With birth. With the biological inheritance we pass forward. In other words, they would not just be studying us. They would be rewriting us. Many who believe in this idea argue that the beings most often described in abduction reports, especially the so-called Greys, are not interested in human biology by accident. One explanation that appears again and again is that they may no longer be a fully functional species themselves. That for some unknown reason they may have lost the ability to reproduce naturally, or suffered some form of severe genetic decline. In that logic, humans would not simply be test subjects. We would be a biological resource. A solution. A species from which they can take what they no longer have. But there is another possibility, and it may be even darker. Not that these beings are trying to save themselves, but that they are trying to create something capable of living here. Something that can function among humans, look like them, learn human behavior, human language, even human emotion without ever being fully human. At that point, hybridization begins to look like something much larger than a series of isolated experiments. It starts to resemble a silent infiltration, a hidden process unfolding in the shadows, where the line between human and non-human becomes harder and harder to see. That is why, in some of the darkest versions of this story, hybrids are not seen as simple laboratory results. They are seen as the final stage of a plan. A new generation created slowly, carefully, and in secret. Prepared to blend in, to observe, and perhaps one day to take control without the need for a visible invasion, without enormous ships in the sky, and without open war. Not through force. Through resemblance. Through mixture. Through gradual integration. What makes all of this even more disturbing is that, in these stories, human beings are never given a choice. There is no consent. No explanation. No meeting between equal civilizations sitting down and deciding anything together. There are only people taken in the middle of the night, bodies examined, memories fractured, and the unbearable feeling that something intimate was violated without permission. That is what turns the idea of hybridization into a biological nightmare. This is no longer just about aliens visiting Earth. It is about the possibility that they can enter the most personal part of human existence and alter it. And maybe that is why this idea has survived for so long in the collective imagination. Because it touches one of the deepest fears of the modern world. The fear of losing control over your own body. The fear of being changed without knowing it. The fear of discovering that the biological identity of the human species may not be as secure as we once believed. If the lights seen in the sky are only the visible side of the phenomenon, then everything connected to hybridization may be its hidden side. The cold and invasive side. The part that does not just want to be seen but wants to enter us. In many other conspiracy theories, the greatest dangers come from secret weapons, hidden technologies, or systems of total surveillance. Here the danger goes much deeper. This is no longer about what is being built inside a laboratory. It is about what may be built out of us. Out of our DNA. Out of our reproduction. Out of our ability to bring something into the world that may one day no longer belong entirely to humanity. And maybe the most sinister part of all is this. If such a program really existed, the final product would not be a weapon. It would not be a craft. It would not be a machine. It would be something alive. Something that can think, look, and walk among human beings without being immediately recognized for what it truly is. Something that carries part of us but is not entirely one of us. And at that point, the question is no longer whether extraterrestrials have visited Earth. The real question becomes how much of them has already been brought here. And how much of us has already been taken. When people hear the word extraterrestrial, they usually imagine the same thing. Beings from other planets crossing space in impossible craft, arriving here from some distant star system. But there is another idea, one far stranger and for many even more disturbing. The idea that these entities are not coming from outer space at all. That they do not travel across galaxies to reach us. That in one way or another they have always been close. Perhaps hidden. Perhaps invisible. Perhaps existing in a parallel reality that sometimes overlaps with our own. That is where the concept of ultraterrestrials begins. This idea is most often associated with author and ufologist John Keel, who suggested that many UFO sightings, strange beings, and paranormal events might all come from the same source. Non-human entities capable of taking different forms and manipulating human perception. Later, Jacques Vallée moved in a similar direction, arguing that many UFO reports do not fit the simple image of visitors from outer space, and that the phenomenon may be connected to a parallel or interdimensional reality rather than just travel between planets. And that is where things become immediately more unsettling. Because if we are talking about classic extraterrestrials, the mind can still place everything inside a familiar framework. They come from somewhere else, arrive here, and then return. There is a distance between us and them. There is a there and a here. But if the ultraterrestrial idea is even partly true, then that distance disappears. then we are no longer talking about visitors who discovered us by chance. We are talking about something that may exist beside us, around us, perhaps even layered over our reality without most people ever being able to perceive it. That is exactly what makes the idea so hard to process, because it completely changes the question. We are no longer just asking whether we are alone in the universe. We begin asking whether we are alone in our own reality. Whether there are other intelligences occupying the same space, but in another layer of existence. A layer that we only touch at certain moments, in certain places, or in certain states of consciousness. And when those layers overlap, we see what we call UFOs, entities, apparitions, impossible creatures, or events that seem to defy ordinary logic. This idea tries to explain something the classic alien theory has never explained very well. Why the phenomenon feels so absurd. Why the same kinds of entities described in the modern world sometimes resemble aliens, while in the past they might have been called angels, demons, fairies, spirits, or supernatural beings. Why the appearances seem to shift depending on the time period, the culture, and the expectations of the witnesses. From this point of view, we may not be dealing with simple visitors from space at all, but with a much older, more fluid, and more deceptive phenomenon that has worn many masks throughout history. And if you look at it from that angle, many strange cases begin to take on a different shape. They no longer feel like encounters with advanced technology alone. They begin to look like violations of reality itself. Objects appearing and disappearing without logic. Entities that do not move in normal ways. Missing time. Distortions of perception. Absurd messages. Behaviors that seem more symbolic than practical. Instead of a straightforward visitation scenario, it starts to feel like something that interferes not only with the physical world, but also with the mind, the body, and the way human beings interpret experience. From there, one of the darkest interpretations of the entire phenomenon begins to emerge. Maybe these entities do not simply want to be seen. Maybe they influence the way they are seen. Maybe they do not appear as they truly are, but in a form that the human mind can tolerate or interpret. In the Middle Ages, people saw demons and angels. In the modern age, they see aliens and craft. But the source may be the same. Not because all of those stories are identical, but because they all seem to touch the same unstable territory between reality, symbolism, and fear. That also changes the way we look at abductions, close encounters, and missing time experiences. If ultraterrestrials are not biological beings simply arriving from another planet, then perhaps their purpose is not exploration in the ordinary sense. Perhaps they are not conducting research the way a scientist would. Perhaps they operate according to rules we do not understand at all. Perhaps their interaction with human beings is closer to manipulation of perception, influence over consciousness, or intrusion into a mental and spiritual space, not just a physical one. And that is where the theory becomes even more oppressive. Because classic extraterrestrials, no matter how frightening they may seem, are still something external. Another species. Another civilization. But ultraterrestrials feel like something else entirely. They feel like an intelligence that not only enters our world, but can distort the very way we experience it. An intelligence that not only hides itself, but may control the act of revelation itself. In other words, we may not be seeing what they truly are. We may only be seeing what they allow us to see. If that is true, then many of the strangest elements of the phenomenon are no longer accidents. They become part of the mechanism. The absurd appearances, the contradictory messages, the almost theatrical scenes, the entities that seem at different times ridiculous, sacred, mechanical, or deeply symbolic. All of it could be part of a form of control. A way to disorient, confuse, and prevent human beings from understanding what is really standing behind the curtain. That is why, for some researchers and writers, the ultraterrestrial idea is far more disturbing than the extraterrestrial one. Because we are no longer talking about beings that need ships, fuel, and cosmic distances. We are talking about a presence that may already be here. A presence that can appear in different forms, influence symbols, beliefs, and experiences, and perhaps follow humanity across centuries. something that does not have to arrive because it never truly left. And then a far more disturbing question appears. If these entities have always been here, what do they actually want? Why do they reveal themselves only in fragments? Why do they create fear? Why do their interactions feel so intimate, so symbolic, and so destabilizing to the human mind? These do not feel like diplomatic contacts between two species. They feel more like intrusions, tests, acts of influence, sometimes even deliberate provocations, as if the goal is not to teach us anything clearly, but to keep us in a state of permanent uncertainty. And maybe that is the most sinister part of the entire idea. Not that such beings might exist, but that they might exist in a way far closer, more invisible, and older than we ever imagined. Not high above us among the stars, but here at the edge of perception. Always near, but never clear enough to be fully captured in proof, in photographs, or in ordinary language. And if that is true, then the UFO phenomenon is not just a mystery about the sky. It is a mystery about reality itself. About how much of what we see is truly all that exists. About the possibility that our world is not a closed space, but only one layer of a much larger structure. And sometimes, very rarely, something from that other layer looks back. Of all the dark ideas surrounding the UFO phenomenon, few are more disturbing than this one. Somewhere inside the American national security system, there may have been people who reached a conclusion even more frightening than the alien hypothesis itself. Not that these entities came from another planet, but that they were something far older, far more deceptive, and far more dangerous. Something that, in their eyes, was not extraterrestrial at all, but demonic. The name most often attached to that alleged hidden circle is the Collins Elite, a term largely associated with Nick Redfern's 2010 book Final Events, where he described claims about a small network of officials and connected insiders who viewed UFOs not as advanced visitors from space, but as a spiritual threat. What makes this idea so unsettling is that it completely flips the usual framework. Instead of asking whether governments covered up contact with non-human intelligence, it raises a darker possibility. What if some people inside that system believed the phenomenon was never about contact at all? What if they believed it was a form of deception? Not something arriving to teach humanity, but something appearing in whatever form was necessary to mislead, manipulate, and slowly reshape how human beings understand reality. The core of that claim traces back to accounts involving Father Raymond Boch, a priest and ufology researcher, who said he was approached in the early 1990s by two physicists connected to the Department of Defense. According to Boch, those men told him there were individuals inside government circles who had concluded that the UFO phenomenon had a demonic, not extraterrestrial nature. That account became one of the main foundations for the later Collins Elite narrative. And that is where everything becomes heavier. Because once you look at it through that lens, the lights in the sky are no longer the main issue. The real fear becomes the intelligence behind them. An intelligence that presents itself as superior, mysterious, and transformative, while hiding what it really is. In that view, encounters, channeling, automatic writing, messages from so-called space brothers, and even promises of enlightenment or salvation would not be signs of benevolent contact. They would be bait, a mask, a carefully shaped illusion designed to pull people away from truth by offering them a false revelation in its place. Redfern's account frames exactly that concern as central to the people he wrote about. This is also why the idea feels so much darker than the standard alien narrative. A civilization from another star system is still something the human mind can categorize. It is foreign, but it remains part of a material universe. It still belongs to a framework of distance, travel, biology, and technology. But something interdimensional, deceptive, and spiritual in nature belongs to an entirely different category of fear. It is not just unknown. It is invasive. It does not merely appear. It penetrates belief, perception, and meaning. In some versions of the Collins Elite claims that fear was connected not only to UFO sightings, but also to occult currents, altered states, and the broader overlap between paranormal experiences and non-human encounters. Redfern's book also ties parts of this hidden lineage idea to post-war intelligence anxieties and to figures like Jack Parsons, whose life linked early rocketry with ritual occultism, though these links remain part of a controversial narrative rather than something established by official records. What keeps this idea alive is that it never fully disappeared from modern discussion. Years after Final Events was published, former Pentagon official Luis Elizondo said publicly that he had encountered people inside government and defense spaces who interpreted the phenomenon in explicitly religious or demonic terms. He did not validate the broader mythology as fact, but his remarks reinforced the idea that this way of thinking was not purely fictional. It existed, at least as a mindset, inside parts of the system. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. Not simply that strange things may have been seen, but that some of the people closest to the classified side of the subject may have looked at those things and decided they were not dealing with visitors from the stars. They may have believed they were dealing with something that uses appearances the way a predator uses camouflage. Something that changes form depending on the culture looking at it. Something that once may have been called angels or demons, and is now called extraterrestrial only because modern people no longer interpret the unknown through the language of religion. That idea connects to something even older and more unsettling. Across history, human beings have described encounters with entities that seem to cross the line between the physical and the spiritual. Sacred beings, fallen beings, tricksters, apparitions, watchers. If the same intelligence has always been there, only changing the costume to fit the age, then modern UFO encounters may not be a new phenomenon at all. They may be the newest face of a much older intrusion. That is exactly why this chapter feels so dark. Because it suggests that the greatest danger may not be advanced technology, hidden bases, or recovered craft. It may be the possibility that the phenomenon is designed to be misunderstood. That confusion is part of its nature. That the contradictions, absurdities, and psychological effects are not flaws in the reports but clues. Clues that whatever is behind all of this does not simply want to be discovered. It wants to control how it is interpreted. There is an important line that has to be kept clear here. There is no public evidence proving that a formally documented, officially acknowledged group called the Collins Elite operated exactly as described in conspiracy circles. The term itself is primarily tied to Redfern's book, and much of what surrounds it comes through second-hand claims, interviews, and later retellings rather than declassified proof. But the absence of a definitive file is exactly what has kept the idea alive. For some people, that makes it mythology. For others, it makes it the kind of truth that would never be allowed into daylight. And maybe that is what stays with you in the end. Not just the thought that a few officials may have feared UFOs for religious reasons, but the possibility that they arrived at that fear after seeing a pattern. A pattern that did not look like space exploration. A pattern that looked like manipulation, deception, influence. A force that does not only enter the sky but enters belief itself. And if that is true, then the question changes completely. The mystery is no longer whether something came here from another world. The real question becomes far darker. If they are not extraterrestrials, then what are they? And why did some of the people closest to the phenomenon begin to believe they were not looking toward the stars at all, but into something far deeper and far more ancient?
This is one of the strangest parts of the whole story.
In February 1959, 9 young Soviet hikers died in the Ural Mountains, in a case that remains one of the most disturbing mysteries of the last century. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, and what the search teams found later was so strange that people have been asking the same question ever since. What really happened that night? Their tent had been cut open from the inside. That means they did not leave normally through the entrance. They wanted out as fast as possible. And they did not run during daylight when they might still have had a chance to orient themselves. They ran into the freezing night across an empty mountain, some of them nearly barefoot and without enough clothing. That was the detail that shocked people from the very beginning. Because anyone who hears that immediately understands one thing. Something terrified them so badly that they chose almost certain death in the snow instead of staying inside the only shelter they had. When their bodies were found, things became even more unsettling. Some had died of hypothermia, but others had severe injuries, including fractures and massive trauma to the chest and skull. Everything about it felt wrong. It did not look like an ordinary hiking tragedy. It did not look like a simple mistake in the mountains. It looked as if something had pushed them out of normal reality and into a night of total panic. For years, the official explanation was so vague that it only made the mystery worse. It was said that they died because of an unknown compelling force. But that explained almost nothing. It did not explain the fear. It did not explain why they cut their way out of the tent. It did not explain why they fled like that. And because of those gaps, more and more theories began to grow around the case. Some involved military testing. Some involved rare natural phenomena. And some went much further. One of the darkest ideas is that the Dyatlov group may have encountered something that did not belong to our world. The alien theory took hold partly because there were reports of glowing orange spheres seen in the sky over the Urals around that time. For some people, those lights were just another strange detail with no proven connection. But for others, they became the key to the entire case. A possible sign that those 9 hikers were not alone on that mountain. And when you look at it from that angle, the whole night starts to feel even more sinister. You are no longer just looking at a group caught in extreme weather. You are looking at 9 isolated people, deep in the wilderness, possibly seeing something they were never meant to see. Maybe a light descending over the mountain. Maybe an object that moved in a way nothing familiar should move. Maybe something so unnatural that their first instinct was no longer to think but to run. That is one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. Their panic feels immediate. They did not stop to dress properly. They did not take time to prepare. They did not react like experienced hikers trying to manage a dangerous situation. They reacted like people who felt the threat was already there. Immediate. Close. So close that there was no time left for anything except escape. In the darker interpretations, that behavior is seen as a sign of an encounter with something unknown. Some believe they may have been exposed to a force that affected their perception. Others think they may have seen something impossible. Maybe they were disoriented by a light, a sound, a presence, or some kind of phenomenon the human mind could not process normally. In that version, their flight was not simply a reaction to snow or cold. It was the reaction of people who, for a few moments, felt reality itself break apart. Then there are the injuries, and this is where people push the theory even further. For those who believe in the alien explanation, the fact that some of the victims had devastating internal trauma, with no clear signs of a normal struggle, made the case even more suspicious. Some spoke of shockwaves. Others imagined an unknown form of energy. Some went as far as suggesting non-human intervention. None of that was ever proven. But the absence of a final explanation strong enough to close the case completely left the door open for those ideas to survive. And maybe that is exactly why Dyatlov Pass is so hard to forget. It is not just a mystery about death. It is a mystery about fear. About that one moment nobody saw, but that seems to have changed everything. The moment when 9 experienced young people understood, or believed they understood, that they could not stay there for even one more second. Of course, in recent years more modern explanations have been offered, especially the idea of an avalanche or a slab snow slide that may have triggered the initial panic and helped explain some of the injuries. On paper, that version makes sense. But even so, the case has never lost its strange atmosphere. Because not every mystery survives only through the lack of an explanation. Some survive because of the feeling they leave behind. And Dyatlov Pass carries exactly that feeling. It leaves you with the sense that something happened on that mountain, in that darkness, that was never fully understood. And that is why the alien theory never completely disappeared. Not because there is clear proof that non-human beings were there, but because this case leaves behind a very dark empty space. A space the mind almost instinctively tries to fill. And when you have a tent cut open from the inside, 9 bizarre deaths, injuries that still feel unsettling, a frozen night on an empty mountain and orange lights reported in the sky, the idea that they encountered something beyond this world starts, for some people, to feel less absurd than the silence left behind by the official version. Maybe the truth was simpler. Wind, snow, panic, and a chain of fatal decisions in a place with no mercy. But maybe it was not. Maybe, up there in that darkness, 9 people saw something they could not understand. Something that made them run straight into death. And maybe that is the question that has haunted this case for decades. Not who they were. Not where they died. But what made them run. In 1976, a single image sent back by the Viking 1 orbiter sparked one of the most enduring controversies in space conspiracy history. In the Cydonia region of Mars, there appeared to be a massive formation that, from one angle and under the right lighting, looked strikingly like a human face. For some, it was nothing more than an illusion created by shadows and terrain. For others, it was proof that something impossible was sitting on the surface of Mars. A sign. A monument. Or maybe the remains of a lost civilization. NASA's position has remained clear for years. The original image had low resolution, the lighting exaggerated the shape, and later high-resolution images showed an eroded landform, not an artificial sculpture. But what kept this mystery alive was never just the face itself. It was everything people believed they could see around it. Once researchers, writers, and conspiracy theorists started looking more closely at Cydonia, they argued that the face was not standing alone. They claimed the surrounding region also contained strange geometric formations, pyramid-like structures, and alignments that did not feel random at all. That is when the idea began to grow that the face on Mars was only one part of something much bigger. The ruined remains of an ancient complex, buried and damaged by time. NASA has acknowledged that Cydonia contains many mesas, buttes, ridges, and knobs that can appear striking from orbit. But the official explanation remains geological, not artificial. And that is where things become far more interesting. Because at that point, this is no longer just about one visual illusion. It becomes about what happens when the human mind sees order where science says there should only be natural chaos. A human face might be dismissed as coincidence. But once people begin seeing pyramids, patterns, and structures that appear too deliberate to be accidental, the simple explanation of erosion starts to feel unsatisfying to them. That is exactly where the fascination with the so-called anomalies of Cydonia came from. One of the most famous examples is the so-called D&M pyramid, a nearby landform that some interpreted as an almost perfectly designed pyramid. NASA published imagery of it as well and referred to it by that nickname, but treated it as another natural feature within the Cydonia landscape rather than evidence of architecture. What makes the whole region so haunting is that, for those who believe this interpretation, Mars stops being just a cold, dead planet. It becomes a tomb. A place that may still preserve the traces of a very ancient intelligence. Some have gone as far as saying these formations could be the ruins of a long-vanished Martian civilization, destroyed by catastrophe, war, or planetary collapse. In that view, the face is not just a rock formation. It is a monument, a relic, maybe even a warning carved into the landscape itself. And maybe that is why this idea is so hard to erase from people's imagination. Because a face is not a neutral shape. A face suggests intention. It suggests that someone wanted to be seen. That someone wanted to leave behind a mark strong enough to survive time. That somewhere in that silent landscape, there may once have been a mind looking outward and refusing to disappear without a trace. NASA has said the opposite. In the higher resolution images taken in 1998, 2001 and later, the face breaks apart visually into an eroded hill without clear artificial features. But for people who do not trust the official explanation, that is exactly where the suspicion begins. Every time NASA released sharper images, those convinced that something was really there made the same argument. The angle was different. The lighting was different. The formation was being reinterpreted on purpose. What looked obvious in 1976, they said, was later explained away through technical language. NASA responded that the difference comes from better image quality and different illumination conditions, not from any attempt to hide the truth, and pointed to later visible light and infrared images as further evidence that the landform is natural. That is what makes Cydonia such a perfect mystery for a video like yours, because it sits right at the breaking point between two completely different ways of looking at the same thing. Some people see an eroded hill shaped by wind, dust, and time. Others see the remains of a lost world. And between those two interpretations is one of the most powerful questions any anomaly can leave behind. What happens when an image seems to say more than science is willing to accept? There is also something else that gives this place such power in conspiracy culture. Mars carries a unique aura in the modern imagination. It is close enough to feel real but distant enough to remain untouchable. It is studied constantly, but the average person can never walk there, touch the stone, or settle the question with their own eyes. And that distance gives every strange formation on Mars an advantage. As long as it remains far away, imagination will keep filling the silence around it. To me, the most fascinating part is not even whether the face was real or not. It is how quickly it became a symbol. Within just a few years, the face on Mars was no longer just a Viking image. For many people, it had already become proof that humanity was being lied to about Mars. Then, as newer images appeared, the idea did not die. It changed form. It became the perfect example of a battle between perception and authority, between what people believe they see and what institutions insist is really there. And if you look at Cydonia through its darkest interpretation, the whole landscape starts to feel heavier. You are no longer looking at rocks and shadows. You are looking at the possible remains of a buried history, the traces of a civilization that may have been erased, the possibility that Mars was not always a dead desert but once held intelligence, architecture, and maybe even collapse. In that interpretation, the face is no longer just a face. It becomes the last witness. Of course, the official explanation remains firm. NASA and later orbital imagery support the conclusion that this is a natural landform, one of many in Cydonia, shaped by erosion, perspective, and light. From a scientific point of view, that is still the dominant explanation and the one best supported by the available data. And yet the fascination never really dies, because some images become stronger than the explanations that follow them. And maybe that is exactly what happened here. One photograph from 1976 was enough to plant a question in the human mind that never fully went away. What if, somewhere on Mars, among the formations of Cydonia, we are not just looking at geology? What if we are looking at the ruins of a truth we were never meant to find? What strikes me most about Göbekli Tepe is the feeling that a place like this should not exist so early in human history. We are talking about a site built by hunter-gatherer communities, long before the rise of the civilizations people usually associate with monumental architecture. And yet, when you look at it, it does not feel primitive at all. It feels intentional. It feels symbolic. It feels like something created by people who were already thinking in terms far bigger than simple survival. That is exactly why Göbekli Tepe fascinates me so much. When I look at it, I do not see a group of people focused only on food, shelter, and the struggle to stay alive. I see human beings who were already trying to give form to something deeper, something spiritual, something ritualistic, something that mattered enough for them to gather, carve, build, and shape massive stone pillars with a level of purpose that still feels unsettling even now. And that is where the ancient alien connection starts to pull people in. Because the question appears almost immediately. How were people this ancient able to create something so organized, so massive, and so symbolically rich? If they did not have metal tools, if they did not have the wheel, if they were not living inside the kind of advanced society we usually imagine, then where did that leap come from? Where did that vision come from? Where did that knowledge begin? For me, that is what makes this place so powerful. Not because it proves anything extraterrestrial, but because it feels ahead of its time. When you see those pillars and the way the space itself seems carefully designed, it does not feel like you are looking at the first awkward steps of human culture. It feels like you are looking at a civilization of thought that was already mature in some deeper sense. A worldview already forming. A sense of ritual already present. A connection to death, symbolism, animals, and the sacred that feels far more developed than many people expect from a site that old. That is why so many people look at Göbekli Tepe and feel that history is still missing something. Some believe the site is evidence that humanity did not make its first great leap alone. That maybe there was some outside influence, some transferred knowledge, some contact that pushed human beings toward ritual, architecture, and organization much earlier than conventional history is comfortable admitting. I'm not saying that is proven. It is not. But I completely understand why a place like this makes people ask those questions. What makes it even more interesting is that Göbekli Tepe does not need to be exaggerated to feel unbelievable. It is already incredible on its own. Even without any conspiracy attached to it, the site forces people to rethink what early humans were capable of. And maybe that is the real reason it keeps pulling people in. Because it sits right on the edge between awe and suspicion. Between admiration for what ancient people may have achieved, and the uneasy feeling that maybe we still do not fully understand how they achieved it. To me, Göbekli Tepe does not feel like an ordinary ruin. Feels like a memory from a world so ancient that we can barely translate it anymore. And when a place more than 11,000 years old still feels like it is holding back part of its meaning, the temptation to see something more than stone and ritual becomes almost impossible to resist.
Some truths stay hidden. Subscribe for more.